The QUO Podcast. Change your way.
I'm Ali, co-host of the QUO Podcast. Today's podcast is a little bit different in that it focuses on something deeply personal for me. When I was 9, my mum was diagnosed with breast cancer. For almost 10 years, we thought she'd beat it, but she eventually developed secondary breast cancer and passed away just a week after my 21st birthday. For over a decade, I never really connected with any other woman who had lost her mum so young, and I often felt like I could only talk openly about my grief to a select few, or else it could cause discomfort and awkwardness for others. I still have reoccurring dreams where mum is alive, and waking up on those days is difficult. So when I came across the podcast Not So Linear, featuring a young Brit living in Sydney called Tamsin Millard, who lost her mum at only 18, I felt seen. She was talking openly with the aim of normalising conversations around grief and loss. Even before meeting her, I admired her. I also really wanted her on the podcast, and lucky enough, she agreed to come in and talk to me. Tamsin, thank you so much for speaking to me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be here.
It feels kind of surreal talking to you because I resonated so much with your podcast, and you seem like someone who really understands my experience.
I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there. It's the whole point of the podcast and why I've done it is because I struggled for so long. You know, my mum died when I was 18 years old, and probably throughout most of my 20s, I didn't really talk to anyone about her. Not even my own siblings. It was something that was even hard for or painful for us to talk about together. So, you know, over the last couple of years, it's been a bit of a healing journey for me, understanding my grief, delving into the emotions, and really trying to question what is the story of grief I'm trying to tell myself? How do I start opening up to the world about it and acknowledging what happened?
That's a really powerful way of constructing it. It's sort of like writing your story on your own terms, and I think that maybe subconsciously that's something that I've been trying to do as well. But this is actually the first time that I have, I guess, talked openly on a public forum about it, so it's a little bit daunting. I guess I have these conversations with myself, but until listening to your podcast, I didn't have that sense of community around other women who've had the same experience of losing their mum at such a young age. And I guess I think that's a really unique experience, losing a mum at a really young age.
Definitely
so
is.
For me, my mum, you know, I considered her a best friend, but regardless of your relationship with your mum, there's something really seminal about that experience.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about your mum. Could you tell me a little bit about her?
Yeah, definitely. So my mum and our relationship was quite complicated, and I talk about it a lot in my podcast, you know, and it's the reason why it's called Not So Linear, because I think with grief, you know, your stages of how you feel and your emotions just keep changing. And the reason how that all happened was my mum actually had a mental health condition called delusional disorder. And if I take it back to the early days of when I lived with my mum and when everything was happy, she was, you know, such a smiling and loving and caring mum. I've really tried recently to connect with her and look at old photos and remember all those good happy times. But as the years went by, you know, things just kind of deteriorated, and back in the 90s and early 2000s, no one talked about mental health conditions, did they? Especially something as severe as delusional disorder. So, you know, our relationship did deteriorate, and because of that, that is what has made my grief so kind of distorted and really hard to cope with, because I spent a few years of, the last years of her life not in contact with her. We didn't speak. So, yes, my mum and I had a good relationship in the early days, but throughout my teenage life, I almost think I grieved twice, because I grieved the loss of her in terms of losing her to that condition, and then secondly, she passed away when I was 18 with pneumonia. which is something that, you don't really think a 40-odd person would pass away with something like that. It's very similar to COVID, I guess. It's a lung condition. So, yeah, I think losing a parent when you're so young is something so traumatic, but you don't necessarily notice at that point in your life. Your life is at such a changing point, isn't it? You're becoming an adult and you don't know who you are, and you've already lost your parent.
I really connected with a lot of what you said, and it's interesting because I feel like while we're coming from a different experience, I did have a really close relationship with my mum until she passed away. But my mum passed away from breast cancer, and she was first diagnosed when I was 9. So I think that sense of, I guess, grieving 2 times, it was almost like I never could believe that she would be with us for a really long time, and ultimately, unfortunately, that ended up happening. But I guess the other aspect of it with breast cancer is that there's a real deterioration in terms of health. And so the mum that I knew, up until the age of, say, 20 was not necessarily the person who passed away a year later. So again, I really connected with you in terms of the complexity of that grief journey, because I like to remember my mum when she was, vibrant, this amazing social pediatric neurologist, incredibly smart, incredibly social. But after that year, she was kind of a shadow of her former self. So it's not only about, I guess, grieving that person, but also the trauma associated with their decline. And I know a mental health illness is completely different, but it changes someone in a similar way. So what I'm curious about is having that lived experience of, your mum's mental health illness. Did that perhaps, did it help you or hinder you in the early stages of your grieving?
I would say it definitely hindered, because she wasn't part of our life for a few years when she was like that, because we didn't live with her and I didn't see her for the best part of 2 years maybe. So when she did actually pass away, well, nothing really changed in my life because we hadn't had her there for a couple of years. So my life just continued, and I was an 18-year-old that had just finished school. I was going to university. I was about to have all this partying and boys, all these fun things that completely distracted me from my grief. And how can you grieve someone that hadn't been there for the last few years, that you thought had rejected you? I felt like my mum didn't want to know me or didn't want to associate with me because I didn't realise that she had been that ill. I can't connect with delusional disorder. I don't know what that really means, or I definitely didn't at the time. And my family didn't really talk about it. It just kind of happened, and then I was off into the next chapter of my new life, moving out into university. So I think it just becomes one of those things where I blocked it out, and it's a common thing I'm finding with other young women like us who've lost their parent at a young age. You don't necessarily face your emotions head on. You almost just, I think young people are so resilient, you just full steam ahead, and you don't necessarily want to, face the emotion.
I feel like as a very avoidant person, I totally relate to that, and I think I've been avoidant in my grief as well. As a 21-year-old, I remember maybe going out, a week after my mum had passed away, just blocking it out, not because I could necessarily be full steam ahead, but just because it was the only way to survive as a coping mechanism. And I think it's so related to what you're trying to do with Not So Linear. The fact that we couldn't necessarily talk openly about it or didn't feel we had that support was probably really detrimental to the way we sort of processed grief at such a young age. So I'm curious, for me, I was really avoidant, as I said, but sometimes it would just come out, like I would just, be out partying and suddenly just crying. Crying. And I think people found that really confronting, because especially my closest friends and pretty much everyone around me, apart from my brother, there was no one who could really relate to that level of loss. Did you have similar experiences?
Yeah, totally. I think I was the same. When I went to university, I remember telling people, oh, my mum just passed away 3 months ago. What are 18-year-old people going to say to that? They don't understand what that feels like. So I felt like, the drunken crying would come out, and you just got to the point where you just continued with life as normal because people didn't necessarily know how to ask you, or they didn't want to upset you. And I think that is the problem in society. People are scared because they feel uncomfortable. And that's what I really want to try and change now, because how can we help a grieving person if the other person who's there that's meant to listen won't even give them 5 minutes of their own awkwardness? Like, we should learn to sit with the uncomfortable to help the person that, me and you are going to have this journey for the rest of our life. Why can't somebody else come and sit with us in that pain for 5 minutes?
And I feel like that's so related to just the stigma around death, which I know you've investigated in your podcast, because I was just listening before, but I feel perhaps if we work on reducing that stigma, people will realise that it is okay to be uncomfortable and to feel awkward, and you don't need to think, I can't deal with this, I don't have this experience, I can't be there for that person.
Exactly. And we can all grieve in different ways. Like, just, someone might have lost, I don't know, like a friend that they didn't really know, or a grandparent. They can still find ways to be empathetic and to reach out. I don't think that it's as hard as people may imagine it is. Like, if they actually just really approach somebody who is grieving and ask them if they're okay, that already takes a ton of weight off the person who is so upset and struggling.
And I remember there have been times where, when I was younger, in my early 20s, just after my mum had passed away, I would actually just not say that my mum had passed away, just not mention it indefinitely. Again, the avoidance coming out. But it was almost to protect that other person from the inevitable discomfort. And I feel like when we start having these conversations, we're actually protecting the person who's lost their loved one from having to think about that and the ramifications for the other person.
Yeah. Oh, I've totally done that so many times. Like, being at hairdressers and they're like, oh, so what does your mum do? Oh, yeah, my mum's, she works in an office. Like, my mum actually is dead. But I think it's a common thing, and it's what I found through everyone I've talked to through my community. It is that we're too scared to upset the other person, and that makes us feel as though we're not being heard, because they quickly scurry away and don't want to, really sit with us in that moment. So I think when it comes to, especially as we said when we were so young, trying to find ways to communicate with other people, but it is so hard, isn't it? Like, if I could talk to my younger self again, I really wish I had been more open when I was in new workplaces, or meeting new friends as I moved to different cities. But I do think it is something that really takes a lot of courage too. So I don't think there's one exact answer to it, but I think if society helped be more open, then the other people who are grieving would actually feel more comfortable to then talk about it.
Exactly. It's a two-way street, and I think it's just a symbiotic relationship between reducing that stigma and allowing people to open themselves up to that vulnerability.
Yeah.
I guess I'm interested in your personal journey, whether there was sort of a turning point for you when you started to say, okay, I need to start facing and processing this grief.
So I'll probably take it back to a time in my life where I was really struggling with my own mental health. It must have been probably about a year or so before I moved to Sydney, so maybe 2017, 2018. I just got to this point where I felt so alone, and I was really trying to find like attention and love from other people. And I don't know if you felt this from losing your mum, but when you don't have a mum in your life, you have lost like your biggest cheerleader, the person that's always going to be there for you no matter what. And I felt alone because I didn't have that. So I was searching for a relationship, I was searching for people that had their time to give back to me, and I couldn't find it, and it made me depressed.
I completely understand that, because I feel like, I guess I have a reoccurring thought pattern even now, that it's like, no one will ever kind of love and accept me unconditionally in the same way that my mum did. And as a result, I've always thought, I would need a really big support network, because, my emotional needs are so high, no one person can can understand that fully or can carry that weight fully. So I think that for me, it's important to have a realization that like people can actually carry more than you think that they can, like give them credit, but they'll also, for me, also be this existential loneliness is the only way I can sort of describe it. It's a sense that sometimes when I'm with people, I do feel a sense of isolation and loneliness because of the loss of my mum, even over a decade later. But it's actually accepting that is really important, or at least for my journey, it's been really important, and it was the first step to kind of not confronting, but just starting to process my own grief.
Exactly. And I think they say one of the stages is acceptance, and that is what was happening when I had that depressive kind of stage. I think that was me realizing that, oh my God, I hadn't actually processed any of these emotions about my mum. My grief had never really happened. It wasn't until I was like single and really on my own where I had to give myself love and tell myself that I was okay and that I was, you know, I didn't need anybody else, that I actually thought, okay, I need to do something about this.
I need to do something about this. I've often felt the same, but unfortunately, the feeling for me has been fleeting, and I haven't acted upon it. Danielle Snelling is another young woman who has done something tangible and remarkable. She lost her mother to a rare form of gynecological cancer at the age of 23. She was determined to create a support system for women who had lost their mothers when she had none, so she co-founded Motherless Daughters Australia, a not-for-profit which is dedicated to supporting women and girls who've lost their mothers.
Mum was Italian. Her name is Rosa. And we just had a really close relationship. We had a really beautiful bond with one another, and I guess it was, you know, she died when I was in my early 20s. So at that critical time, I think, where as girls you come through the phase of being a teenager where that's just your mum and you don't really care to know about who she is and where she's from, to moving into that early adult phase where, you know, your mum does somewhat become more of a friend. And I had a very tiny glimpse of that, but then she was taken from me. So, you know, but I'm really lucky. I can say that I had a mum who loved me unconditionally, and I know how much my brother and I were loved by her.
I feel the same because it's just my brother and I as well. And I understand what you're saying about that transition from seeing her as a mum to seeing her as a friend. And it's so special when you kind of realize this is a fully fledged human being with amazing talents, but also, I guess, vulnerabilities and challenges like everyone else. And yeah, I'd love to have had the opportunity to kind of get to know my own mum more like that. But often when people lose a parent, especially a mum, it's really difficult in terms of support systems, and you feel really isolated and alone, like I know I did. Did you feel like you got the support you needed at the time of your mum's passing?
No, absolutely not. I didn't know anyone who had also lost their mum. And I felt like there was such a gap in the support system specific to mother loss for women. I did see a grief counsellor, but I mean, at the end of the day, you know, they don't have lived experience. They haven't lost their mum. And that's what I really found that I needed, somebody who was in that very position, who could understand from a first-hand perspective.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. And I think with grief counselling, while there's some free support services, it's also, when it comes to psychology in Australia, you also have to have enough money to be able to keep seeing someone. So that's a real issue. And I feel like peer support is often overlooked. So I'd love to get an insight into how you started to, I guess, from your own lived experience of not having that support system, decide that you want to start
helping other women and actively create a support system for yourself and other women who'd experienced loss and grief at a really young age?
I went looking for somebody who was like me, I guess. I was a member of just a general grief group on Facebook and a few others. And I put a call out in there and said, is anybody here from Australia who has lost their mum and who's got a brother? So I kind of had a little bit of a criteria that I needed somebody to meet because, the similar in circumstances, the better and more understood you feel. And Eloise came back to me and said, "Hi, yes, that's me, and very happy to meet with you." So we did, and I met with her back in 2013, and we, were in the cafe for 5-6 hours. In the end, I think we had breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and just about everything else in between. And it was just the most. It's really difficult for me to articulate and put into words how powerful and therapeutic that initial meeting was, and to have someone who can almost finish your sentences and someone that doesn't judge you or, tell you to be positive, is just incredibly empowering. So the two of us just kind of, benefited from that conversation so much, and we thought, wow, how amazing would this be if other women, thousands of other women in our shoes, could also have this type of connection and friend in grief, I guess.
So that was 2013, but it wasn't until 2017 that you co-founded Motherless Daughters Australia. So was it obviously a long process, but what was happening in those 4 years of planning?
We started in 2013. We started scoping out what was involved, and Eloise has got a background in pharmacy and I'm a teacher, so we had no idea what we were doing. We spent lots of time trying to learn and research, but the information on the website in terms of how to start a not-for-profit is just, it's jargon, and it's so hard to relate to and kind of put into practical terms. So yeah, most of our time was scoping out how to do that, and we started off, doing the bare minimum and the basic stuff, but, we needed a board of directors. I didn't even know what a board of directors was back then. So I think I probably spent a few weeks, what the hell is a board of directors? So we had to go and find them. And our very first board of directors, our founding board members, were just incredible in terms of helping us set up. And I think it was around 2014 though, I kind of realised how raw my grief really was. So I kind of just dropped the ball for a year with it all, and then we didn't really pick it up again until about 2015. And from 2015 to 2017 is when we found our board members and kind of progressed with the getting pro bono lawyers on board and getting a pro bono website development agency on board and getting those, foundation pieces in place until 2018 when we were a registered not-for-profit organisation.
Well, congratulations on becoming a not-for-profit, because evidently it's a long journey. But now that you have had Motherless Daughters Australia for 3 years, can you tell me about the ways your not-for-profit helps support women and girls in grief?
We aim to connect and support women and girls whose mums have died, and to help them navigate the everyday as well as life's key milestones, because as women we want to lean and need to lean on our mums during those significant milestones, and that's probably something that is most often expressed in our support group. So a lot of our work is kind of directed at how can we support women during those during that stage of life, and as a result of that, we've developed our support group on Facebook, which has just got almost 5,000 women in there. So it's a peer support platform. We've also got our face-to-face events in a non-COVID world, I guess. And, we've got a few online initiatives to help women, I guess, process the loss of, gain support and honour their mum. And most recently have just launched our new initiative called Friends in Grief, which is like a grief Tinder, I guess. You get matched with somebody who is in similar circumstances as you in terms of age, location, and we will attempt to try and match people based on the cause of their mum's death if they requested for that as well.
I was delighted and potentially a little too excited when I saw that Motherless Daughters Australia was starting a Friends in Grief program. I see it as an opportunity to create a meaningful connection with another woman whose lived experiences mirrors my own. It's all about creating community, and in that way, it's actually very similar to what Tamsin is trying to do through Not So Linear. This is Tamsin reflecting upon what changed for her when she moved from the UK to Sydney.
Now in hindsight, I look at that move and I think, was I escaping? Like, what was I trying to achieve with that? And I think it was slightly an escape, but also I realised that I needed to find something to make me happy again and to kind of pull me out of that, poor mental health that I was in. And I think it was last June was my mum's 10-year anniversary of her death. And I thought, I'm 10 years in and I still haven't really talked to anyone about her. Like, that's not okay. Like, I do need to do something about it. So I reached out to people on Facebook and created my own kind of like grief group. And I met two girls that were very similar age to me who had also lost their mums like in their early 20s. And one of which had lost her mum to a mental health condition as well. So meeting those girls just completely changed how I started to think about my grief, how I could talk about it. And that was the turning point then of how I started my journey.
Was there a sort of light bulb moment where you were like, I want to create this podcast to sort of share my experiences with others or help others? What was motivating you in that? I
think I'd got to the point where I thought, wow, I'm getting good at talking about my mum now, but I'm still not there. Like, I still didn't feel like I was connecting with her. So I was like, I'm going to start talking to people through Instagram. I'm going to go into the communities. There's so many pages on there that it's ridiculous. And then I thought one day, my meetups are kind of slowing down. Not many people are turning up, and a lot of people cancel actually on the day. I started questioning, I wonder why that is. And all I could think was, I think it's because it's an emotional topic. If you don't feel ready to talk about your parent or the person that they've lost, you're not going to go and want to sit in front of 10 other people and talk about it. So I was like, how can I solve this problem? How can I create something that provides people support, but they can do it in the comfort of their own home? And then, as you know, podcasts have exploded over 2020. Okay, I'm going to join that. I'm going to be another podcaster. And that's where it came from. And do you know what? Many people ask me, how did you find, the people that you interview? How do you reach out and get to know them? But because no one really talks about grief, when you ask the people that are so open about it on social media, they're so keen because it's such a taboo topic that's not talked about, that those who are willing to are so inspired to help other people that are, struggling.
I'm interested because I feel like listening to your podcast, I realise how important it is to talk about grief, but sometimes we're not really given the tools in our, day-to-day life. I want to be talking more about my mum, but there's a lot of fear associated with that. So how did you start having conversations about your mum with people who don't necessarily share that lived experience of loss?
Do you know what? In a way, I actually think my podcast was subconsciously something that was my tool to go and help me do that. So I'd not really talked to my current workplace so much about my mum. They knew bits and they knew little, here and there stories, but I think my podcast was almost like okay, this is me, I'm going to go out there now, I want everyone to hear about it because I've spent so long not talking about it that this is my thing now that I can clasp onto. So when I tell people, today I'm doing a podcast episode, that actually becomes my talking point and it opens up that conversation. And I'm not saying every person dealing with grief should go and do that, but I think finding little ways to maybe, put pieces of conversation in there. Maybe it be something just happy or memory that isn't sad, that is actually quite nice for the other person to join in with, and then they realise it's a safe, open conversation. But I'm still not an expert. I'm still learning myself, still on the not so linear journey.
Yeah, I guess I'm interested in this whole idea of, I don't know if you've had this experience, but it's over 10 years for both of us. And there are some people in my life who feel like it is a linear journey, and that with time, things should become less intense. And for me, I think sometimes, maybe overall it's become less intense, but there are still those periods of intensity, like, it's the day after, or, a couple of months after I lost my mum. And I feel like talking to other people, older people in my life who lost parents, and I guess that's an inevitable process in anyone's life. They still, even 20, 30 years on, might feel that kind of intensity of grief. So I think part of normalising the conversation is also normalising the idea that, exactly the whole idea of the podcast, that it can be 30 years and it can be just like it was yesterday. And I think that's sometimes difficult to communicate to people who don't have that degree of loss in their life yet.
Oh, I totally agree. And it's hard, isn't it? Because people forget. I think they think the first year or so is the hard bit. Once you're past the first year, they don't necessarily check in on you anymore. They think that you should have processed all those emotions and had it out. But for me and you, we're going to have still major life events that our mum's not going to be there for. If we get married, or if we have children, or big life achievements like an amazing career path or something like that, that's going to be a trigger for us. We're not going to have that amazing person in our life there cheerleading us on. So it is something that is frustrating to me. It does make people feel more alone. I don't know about you, but when people don't necessarily realise that there are certain times of year, even like Christmas or birthdays.
Mother's Day,
of course, Mother's Day. That is one that is definitely the hardest as well. I try to stay away from social media sometimes when I see all that too, because it can really, make you feel like you're not part of something.
I think for me, I guess I just isolate myself on Mother's Day. And I don't know if that's, again, it's a coping strategy. It's just completely disengaging. And I think I'd like to maybe change my strategy into something where I can be talking to other people about their experiences and not sort of want to burst into tears or feel this kind of, not jealousy, but I guess regret that they have something that I'll never have again. I'm interested in how your podcast has potentially affected your relationship with your family and your siblings.
Yeah, so I have 4 siblings, but 2 of them are from my mum. So 2 are from my dad's new partner. And I would say for my siblings, from my mum, it has made us a lot more open. It's really helped. It's also not just my journey, it's kind of been their journey too, in a way. And it's been so nice because, especially my older brother, who, what boys are like, they don't always open up about things. He's really, listened to all my podcasts. He's tried to understand, and he has asked me questions, and it's just so nice that we can finally talk like that, because I think a lot of the time we all blocked it out from each other, and the last thing that you want to do is see your siblings upset, and I think that's how many siblings act when they've lost a parent. You don't want to bring up that emotion again. But I think this has been a really good thing for us, and we've still got a long way to go, but I think it's really, can't find the word. I think it's just been a really nice healing process for them, and it kind of makes me miss them more, because I think I'm not seeing them for over 2 years now since I moved, and we're going on this journey together, but virtual journey, so we're always having to WhatsApp. But they saw my auntie recently, and she dug out loads of old photos of us, and it's really nice to kind of connect and try and bring my mum back to the surface again and remember the nice memories.
My little brother Jimmy is one of the few people I feel comfortable talking about my mum with. We were both equally in awe of her. We are still. And whether it's a cathartic cry, laughing at her vanity, marvelling at her wit and intelligence, which I, alas, didn't inherit the wit at least. Together we can almost bring her back to life just for a moment. So I can see through that what I could feel by having friends who have similar lived experiences of loss, by having a community of women who actually understand your experience. This is something that Danielle of Motherless Daughters Australia has created for herself.
Since developing, the network and establishing it, probably my core group of girlfriends are all girls I've met through MDA. And, their mums have died in different ways. Some are from cancer, some are from, Eloise's mum died from stroke. But the special thing about that is that, yes, you come together based on, having one thing in common, which is not having our mum. But we hope this is something we hope that Friends in Grief will provide. And certainly for me, I've developed friendships with these women that go beyond the loss of our mum. So they're women that, are like-minded and are people that I would choose to be friends with regardless. It's just that shared experience of grief and loss has brought us together initially and allowed for a meaningful relationship to develop.
Because my focus has been as a young woman who lost her mum on the experience of a young woman who loses a mother. But I mean, women lose their mothers at different ages, and it doesn't necessarily get less intense if you're a little bit older. So in terms of the support group, is it women of varied ages who've lost their mums at different ages? And has it helped kind of normalise this idea of there's never really a right time to lose a parent, regardless of if you're kind of 15 or 50, it's still incredibly painful?
Absolutely. It's still incredibly painful, regardless of the age. But I guess when you lose a mum so young, and we know this because it's backed up by research, when you lose your mum when you're young versus when you lose a mum as a grown, established, sustainable, woman in her own right, it's different. It's not less painful, but it's different. And we know that early mother loss results in things like a loss of identity, maladaptive coping mechanisms, anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, lots and lots of significant lifelong impact that kind of stay with us through to adulthood that continually rear their ugly heads during adulthood. So I guess that's probably the main difference, no less painful, but just different in terms of impact. And something that we did at our events this year actually was when women booked a ticket, they ticked an age bracket that they were in when their mum died, and we grouped them based on age brackets that they were in when their mum died on tables. So it just enhanced a little bit like Friends in Grief, our program, but on a larger scale of tables of 10, where you were sitting with women who were roughly the same age as you were. And it just allowed for, again, those more meaningful relationships to be started, because you've got the same life, the same kind of things in common in terms of milestones or age, but also, our support group, for example, yes, women of all ages are in there. And something that I really love is that, I'm 32 now, but 23 when mum died. I love connecting with women who are 50, 60, 70, who were also 23 when their mum died, because it just acts a little bit as like an informal mentoring role, I guess. And if I'm going to listen to anybody about, I don't know, the good times and the shit times when you don't have your mum, I'll listen to those women who have been there and done that for much longer than me.
I had mental health issues before my mum passed away. Social phobia and generalised anxiety are things that I was diagnosed with in adolescence. But after mum died, I developed reactive and then clinical depression. My experience isn't unique, but I have had the advantage of becoming psychologically literate, both through a psychology degree and, in the spirit of honesty, many years of therapy. I see a place for psychologists, psychiatrists, and counsellors when it comes to processing grief. But I do feel that peer-led support is often undervalued and difficult to find.
We were talking before about this idea of, I guess, the whole concept around psychology and mental health and the way that psychologists are structured. It's a very sort of one-on-one thing. It's not necessarily something that we chat to other people about. I'm interested in your views on how we can make this a more communal process, so we're normalising not only grief but just people having mental health issues, because it is incredibly common. And I think sometimes that both works in our favour, but it also doesn't, because there's this idea that because, everyone might, has depression or anxiety, that it's somehow less legitimate. And I really try to fight against that in my day-to-day, because like you, I've had mental health struggles. I've had, reactive depression and depression and anxiety. And I have felt uncomfortable sometimes talking about that outside my close circle. And I think perhaps if I started talking about it, especially in relation to my mum, people would think I was being a little bit socially inappropriate. But I guess it's just you have to go there to change the social norms.
Do you know, I think a few years ago it was definitely not talked about. I remember I used to go to therapy, I don't know, it must have been about 5 years ago, and I'd leave work and tell people that, I had an appointment, but I wouldn't tell them what type of appointment it was. I do think 2020 and everything around coronavirus has accelerated this kind of shift in people being more accepting of it and knowing that it's okay to go. But I still think there's a long way that we still as a society need to improve it. And I don't think there should be a stigma around going to get help. I just don't see how you can even view someone as being weak or view them as being somebody that isn't doing well in life because they need to go and get help. Like, I love going to therapy, even if I don't have like a mental health struggle. I think you should go, because it really is good to like get someone else's opinion, especially someone that's qualified in helping you draw out those emotions and process your feelings. That would actually make us a better society, so why should we shame people for it?
Exactly. I guess an issue here in Australia is that while we have subsidies for seeing psychologists, it can actually be really expensive.
Yes.
So I've known people who, have lost loved ones and haven't been able to get as regular, psychology or counselling sessions. So I guess that's the focus on peer support, because given, obviously we need to change, social policy needs to change, but that's often a long process. But peer support and networks like Motherless Daughters Australia is, I guess, what we have for now, and I think that can be very powerful.
Yeah. Do you know what I've kind of realised over the last kind of not so linear journey, that the thing that holds people together is community. So why can't we combine therapy and community together? So Motherless Daughters, for example, or these community networks we have, bringing people together at events like that is so therapeutic. It really helps people to feel less alone. Why can't we bring psychologists into the mix of that? Group workshops, group therapy workshops. How is that not a good thing? But it does take courage to attend those things as well, and there's a lot of people that would be shy to talk openly. But what's to say that you couldn't just sit there and listen, but be surrounded in a room full of people that you know feels exactly the same as you? I think there's quite a lot of power in that. And when I went to Danielle's event in Sydney, I was sat in a room of probably about 70 women who had all lost their mums, and it was so emotional, and it was so amazing to know that I had all this support around me, and that if I talked to any of those women, it would have been a safe conversation.
Perhaps part of the reason why Tamsin felt so supported in that moment is because anyone who loses a mum, especially at a young age, changes profoundly. People inevitably change in different ways, but what strikes me as most remarkable about both Tamsin and Danielle is their capacity for empathy and compassion, and how it's motivated them to actually act. So what I wanted to ask Danielle is, how does she think she has changed from the loss of her mum?
Oh, I used to be a really timid person. I got bullied a lot in school, which really affected my confidence and self-esteem. And I have had to grow the biggest set of balls since my mum died it's not funny. And, you know, it's, I feel I've, you know, gained this confidence and self-esteem in certain circumstances, not all circumstances, but certainly when it comes to, you know, navigating the not-for-profit world, or kind of really putting yourself out there and asking for help, or saying, hey, I need to reach all these women, can you help? Or, you know, just really learning to stand up for yourself as well, because you don't have mum there to go to for that advice or reassurance. You kind of have to develop that from within now. So look, certainly, yes, I feel I definitely wouldn't be the person I am now if she was still here.
I'm interested to know what your vision is for the future of Motherless Daughters. What are you hoping for the future?
Well, we know that there's 3.7 million women and girls in Australia who have lost their mum. And we know that 1.2 million of those lost their mum before they turned age 44 as daughters. And you know, my goal is to reach every single one of those, and so that they know that we exist when they need us. But also, you know, I would love to implement support groups Australia-wide, not in a clinical way. We're not clinical whatsoever. We are, you know, real life talk. You know, we don't sugarcoat stuff, and we certainly just want to provide a space where women can come and be themselves and not, you know, not be judged and you know, it sounds like you're feeling such and such. There's certainly a place for that, but peer support aspect and component of that, I think, is just so important to be able to relate. So we want to do lots more stuff in terms of that peer support component. Another thing I'm really passionate about is conducting research. There's no research in Australia whatsoever on the impact of mother loss. We've started to kind of navigate that space and do a little bit. And one of our committee members is actually just about to complete her PhD on the impact of mother loss. But yeah, there's nothing, and we really want to champion research in that space.
After hearing about what Danielle wants to do with Motherless Daughters Australia in the future, I wanted to ask Tamsin what her goals are for the future of her podcast.
I want to kind of expand the topics more. I want to not just look at grief as like losing a person, but, you know, we grieve about so many other things as well. You know, loss of the ability to do things, loss of career, heartbreak. I definitely want to explore more of them too. But I think for me, my personal journey is to get to the point where I can really communicate and connect with my mum. So how do I interview more people that have gone through a complicated grief, that maybe have explored topics of mental health conditions, so that I can really start to dig deeper into how I feel and how I overcome, you know, that struggle that I felt. And I think when you look long-term, not so linear, I would love to have my own book, because I think there's so little resource out there for people, especially, you know, in their 20s and 30s. Something that really resonates with people, but also looks like something you want to open and you want to read. Colourful,
accessible,
and yes. A lot of grief books you look at just have like wilting flowers on the front and a grey and depressing. Something happy and exciting.
As soon as you say grief, everyone's, you know, oh, sad,
Crying.
sad, cry, death. You know, death is part of life, and I think that I'm really inspired by what you're doing. And I just, thank you. Keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you so much. And probably just one last thing to add is, like you said, by being positive about grief, that actually helps you get through like the bad times. And I actually think my grief has helped me to thrive in a way. And whilst that's quite sad to say that I've lost my mum, but it's helped me thrive, without that experience, I don't think I'd be doing the thing that I am today. So the things that I take away from it is the strength and the kind of power to push forward.
Speaking to both Tamsin and Danielle has reminded me that while I've lost someone who was the epicentre of my life for the first 21 years, I've also gained something wonderful. Resilience. I'm resilient, and so is Tamsin, so is Danielle, so are the millions of other young women who've lost their mums. Some days we may not believe it, but to me the fact that we're still here is proof enough. I miss my mum every single day. This episode is in honour of you, Elizabeth Rose Fagan. I love you.